Is there a certain song that has had a profound impact on your life, like a song where you look back and you remember that song as being an important part of your life?
It's funny. I'm not necessarily a huge music person, though I like music, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
But let me give you three different things, okay? The first is that every time I hear a Beatles song, which of course is from way back in the 60s, right? Um, I remember my dad when, and you know the Beatles, right?
Yeah, of course.
When they were first on a show called The Ed Sullivan Show.
Hmm.
It was the first variety show. And they were performing for one of the first times in the States. And my father, may he long rest in peace, saying, "They'll never make it." That sums that up. So I think they did pretty well. The
Oh,
second, a song that I just remember actually sang at our eighth grade graduation back in 1969,
wow.
and it's called "The Sounds of Silence" by Simon and Garfunkel.
Hmm.
Right? And I love the song then, but I find it really interesting that we're 50 plus years later, and the words seem to hold true to where we are. Now, remember that it was written in the time of, Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and those kinds of things, civil rights
Hmm.
first. And one of the verses in it is, in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share. And, it made me realize that's where we are today in the context of people don't listen to each other. There's this, we have a perspective that we may be saying things, but we're not necessarily listening to others.
Of course, it's sort of
And
one-sided with things.
yeah, and we have a very disparate sort of perspective on things. So it's a song that I actually, when I walk, um, you know, I listen to because it makes me think about, and I'm afraid from a political perspective that somehow we may be repeating history and not making the progress that we need and have not learned from uh, things we need to do.
Sort of.
Like, so did that make sense to you?
Yes. Hmm.
So, and the third one, which is, James Taylor, Carole King, others, is, basically you've got a friend,
Okay.
I remember going to my first James Taylor concert and hearing Carole King and others. I just love the song because I think that part of the message in it is no matter what your situation is, no matter how bad things seem, no matter where they are, and no matter where I am, I'll always try to be there for you.
That's
So,
a really uplifting way of looking at things. It's
well, you got to kind of,
yeah.
choose to see. So it's not necessarily as uplifting when you first listen, but that's the perspective. And in relationships, there are good things, there are bad things, there are, challenges and pluses. But on balance, if you can be there for other people, one, it's good, and two, they'll probably be there for you.
Yeah.
So those are the three things that come to mind for me most quickly.
Okay.
Do they make any sense?
Yeah, that make total sense to me. I was actually wanted to. You're mentioning your dad saying that the Beatles weren't going to make it. Are
Right.
there songs that you remember listening to with your parents when you were young? When you were young, was there stuff on the radio or on record?
It's actually funny. When I was young, there was AM radio and FM radio, but not, and most of what my parents were listening to was what I would call news radio, talk shows, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so they weren't necessarily listening to music in the same way, but on weekend we'd watch variety show where today would be crazy, but I remember a show called the Steve Lawrence Show, where it was all a throwback to the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s about that kind of stuff and that kind of music. And I do remember, for example, listening with my parents to some of the Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby and those kinds of people.
Okay, so how about like with your kids? Are there songs that when they were young that you would listen to that like in the car or on a road trip or that kind of thing?
Well, they'll tell you, you know, that some of the couple of the songs I just say are ones that they go, okay, Dad, that's enough already. To, you know, to the as they chose sort of their own music and listen. That's the other thing that's different, is that as our kids, I don't know if this is true for you, but as our kids grew up, you know, and were listening to music in the car, more of it was on their own device than necessarily through, for example, the radio on which is the only way we had to listen to it way
I think that
back
makes
when.
sense.
So no, there aren't necessarily specific ones. There are definitely specific songs that they will be able to tell you that for them were important.
Okay.
But,
All right.
all right.
So how about like what's your opinion on music from today, for example? Like what do you think of the modern music scene? Uh,
It's hard for me to judge because I don't listen to it as much.
okay.
But you know, there's so much more. You know, um, there's more creativity on some levels, and there's more leeway in terms of the way people do things. But you know, um, you know, as I told you, you know, back in the 1960s, if my dad thought, um, you know, that the Beatles were like way out there and not going to make it, think what he would have thought about what you see and hear from many performers today.
Wow, that's a good
You
point.
know, so just a completely different. And you know, my perspective is on that is that rather than my being a judge of the style, is are they having an effective way to communicate with their audiences, and are their audiences responding to them? And I think the answer is, you know, when people are good and whatever, the answer is yes.
Mhm.
I think it's actually interesting. Some of the messages around social justice are even more intense than they were, you know. And, you know, I'm supportive of anything we can do to make the world a better place. And I'd like to think of the use of music uh, to do that. I'm also not unrealistic that there are lyrics and, you know, wording that, you know, I struggle with at times because, you know, I grew up in an era where profanity was not acceptable.
Yeah.
You didn't say things, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
But, and so things were probably less explicit on some levels. But that's true with movie making and other things too.
That's
So,
fair.
all right.
Okay. And then my final question is if you had to recommend one album or one song to somebody, what song would it be?
Well, again, you know, I like almost all. I like all of the Beatles albums from way back
Okay.
when, but you know, I, I would have, because I listen to it almost every day, and it's not, you know, I would. I feel embarrassed to say this, but I probably would have been Simon and Garfunkel, Sounds of Silence,
Okay. That's a solid answer right
or
there.
the great hits, the best hits of, you know.
Okay.
I would go with the best hits of Simon and Garfunkel, James Taylor,
Okay.
and the Beatles. So,
All right.
all right.
Awesome. Well, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to
Oh
talk to
no,
me
you
for a
don't have
little bit.
to listen. First of all, you don't have to thank me. It's actually a pleasure to chat with you.